Hello and welcome, I'm Stormo, and this is, Assassin's Creed Syndicate. And you might be wondering why I'm making a video of this game weeks after it came out. Well, for a start, it actually only just launched on PC. But more importantly than that, I wanted to talk not so much about the game itself, which I think is, it's probably the best Assassin's Creed game I've played. I think that the only other decently good Assassin's Creed game is probably Assassin's Creed 2. I think the rest have been average at best, is probably the best way to say it. I'm one of these people that has a theory that there hasn't actually been a genuinely great Assassin's Creed game. Assassin's Creed 2 is probably close, and I think Syndicate is probably the closest it's come since then to a genuinely great Assassin's Creed game. The thing, I think, though, for me with Syndicate, and the reason I've probably played this more than any other Assassin's Creed game since 2, is that I love the location it's presenting here, and that was kind of what I wanted to talk about in this video, was not so much the game as it was the way the location that this game's set in is presented. And one of the most, I guess, frustrating things with the Assassin's Creed game over the years, the series, is that it's often had these really interesting locations that it hasn't done a great amount with. It wasn't so bad. The first game had its location like in the Holy Lands during the Crusades era. And then the second game, of course, had that great Italian location, particularly the Venice area that it had in the second game, which was really cool. But then 3 and 4 came along, and both of those games weren't quite as strong in terms of their location. 3 tried to cover a lot of space around Boston in the United States, and then 4 had, basically the Caribbean is what 4 had. And they were both interesting enough, but they weren't enough to sort of keep me interested in them. And so I didn't really get into those games. And I think for me, particularly with a game like this, the sense of location and setting, I suppose, is probably the word I'm looking for as we go looking for a flower here. The setting is really important. I like a game where I can get lost in that setting, and I can get quite sort of involved in it. And it's one of the reasons I actually enjoy games like the Grand Theft Auto games and stuff like that. I'm particularly like Grand Theft Auto 5 because I was able to get quite lost in the setting of it, the sort of parody Los Angeles that it had. It's why I always love Skyrim, which, again, in fact, the Elder Scrolls series in general is good at this. I can just get lost in the setting. I'm finding the same thing with Fallout 4 at the moment. I'm getting quite lost in the setting, although I do have some problems with Fallout 4's setting that I'm going to maybe make a video on, I don't know yet. But Assassin's Creed Syndicate is definitely wins on this. It's a Ubisoft game, as we crash into that post. It definitely wins on this aspect because Victorian London is a setting I've always really liked for just general fantasy stories, I suppose. Well, not fantasy stories, just general stories and settings. And one thing that always bugs me, particularly with games that aspire to a steampunk aesthetic, is that they never quite seem to get the Victorian London elements of their settings right. And one of the nice things about this is that not only is it Victorian London, but it's Victorian London done really well. I don't think I've ever played a video game with this kind of setting that I've liked more than Assassin's Creed Syndicate. And just showing off, I was half showing off stuff and I was half like just walking around. We're going to do one of the side missions you can do where you can clear out a section of the various boroughs of London here. And yeah, but the setting, and you can see it from here, you can see this gorgeous way it looks. You can see, I think it's St. Paul's Cathedral in the distance there and all that kind of stuff. And all this other stuff that it has. And the thing with Victorian London, I guess it's so fascinating to me, as someone who considers themselves a minor history buff. I'm not great at history, but I know what I like, I suppose is the best way to say it, is that I've always loved the development of London. I think, as someone who actually also is in love with the concept of the city and the way cities grow and develop over time, I've always loved the way Victorian London provides this great, I suppose, I want to say microcosm, but that's not really the word I'm looking for here. Great sort of, I suppose the only way to put it is example of a city that grows and develops, and especially during the Industrial Revolution. I don't actually get the bonus objectives here. But especially the Industrial Revolution, the way London changed incredibly dramatically in that time, as it became a much more industrialised city, and people from the surrounding countrysides began to move into the city, and it developed and grew. And one of the most important things that happened with London was that it basically became, I don't want to say a nightmarish dystopia, but certainly an early example of a city suffering from elements of urban decay and basically the downside of unrestricted urban growth. And this all happened back at a time when, I guess, nobody really understood what that meant or how that impacted on the way a city could develop. And of course, in this game, you actually start out in the Whitechapel area of London, which is sort of north-ish of the city. I'm not sure it's exactly where the game says it is, but we'll pretend it's north-ish of the city of London. And the Whitechapel area, of course, is famous these days for being where the Jack the Ripper murders occurred. And of course, you could make many YouTube videos about the Jack the Ripper videos. We successfully took that down, by the way. But the other thing, though, is that if you study the sort of the real history of Jack the Ripper and the era it happened, you realise that Whitechapel was quite a cesspit, because it was basically where those who had come to London seeking their fortune ended up when they ended up not seeking their fortune. And so it was quite crime-ridden, and the developments that came out of that were things like the development of the police force. And this game actually has, what's his name, George Aberlane? The guy, he's in Assassin's Creed, but he's also a real historical figure, and was quite known for being one of the... He didn't found the Metropolitan Police, but he was certainly one of its earliest examples of a police detective that was quite capable and able to solve crimes, and he was quite famously involved in the Jack the Ripper murders. Jack the Ripper doesn't show up in this game because it's actually set several years before before his crimes were committed. I believe the exact year is 1868 for this game, which is a good 20-ish years before Jack the Ripper. So yeah. Interestingly though, this game does have a whole series of missions based around finding Springheeled Jack, who is another famous figure of the 19th century. In fact, I believe Springheeled Jack may even go back a bit further, and it's basically this guy who just appeared out of nowhere in front of people. And this is a real thing. Springheeled Jack wasn't something they made up for this game. There is historical evidence that Springheeled Jack was the thing that happened. There have been eyewitness reports and accounts. And no one's ever figured out who he was or how he did what he did, because he literally jumped up the tops of buildings and stuff like that. And while some of it may have been exaggerated through history, just like there's some historical exaggeration with Jack the Ripper, Springheeled Jack, in a lot of ways, is a much more interesting figure, because, of course, he never actually killed anyone. He just terrorised people for, I think, like 50 or 60 years, or some ridiculous amount of time. And the descriptions of him are always very similar. You can go on Wikipedia and look this guy up, and it's worth doing, because he's actually quite... It's one of those ones where I don't recommend reading that Wikipedia article late at night, because you'll probably have nightmares about it. And in fact, I wouldn't recommend reading Jack the Ripper's Wikipedia article, because it's actually... Jack the Ripper was pretty damn terrifying, as was Springheeled Jack. And yeah, he shows up in this game as well. But the whole thing with that is that you had this time, and the Victorians were, I suppose, they were probably one of the first example I can think of as a recognisable, I suppose, 20th century modern culture in a lot of ways. Even though they weren't 20th century, the culture they had and the developments they had, the city they had in terms of Victorian London was very much one we would recognise now in the 21st century, but of course through the 20th century as well. And it's basically where the seeds of 20th century urbanisation and development come from, is London in the 19th century, when it was literally the heart of the British Empire. And in fact, speaking as someone from Melbourne, I can safely say that London, of course, got a lot of those riches from this side of the world, because of course it taxed the Australian colonies and made a lot of its money from doing so, and became quite rich, as Melbourne was at the time. And in fact, the interesting thing here is that a lot of the buildings and architecture you see in this game don't actually exist in London anymore, of course, because most of them were either pulled down or destroyed. Any remaining ones would have been destroyed during the Second World War, where a lot of London's Victorian era architecture was actually destroyed. So if you want to see good examples of Victorian era architecture, the best city to go to is actually, in fact, Melbourne in Australia, because Melbourne still has a lot of standing examples of architecture at that time, because like London, it actually mostly grew and developed during the Victorian era. In fact, it was founded in 1835 as a city, and most of its growth happened in the latter half of the 19th century, or at least most of its initial growth happened then during the Victorian gold rush of the 1850s, and then was actually known as Marvellous Melbourne for a long time, until the 1890s, when it hit a massive economic recession that probably set the city's growth back by a good 30 to 40 years, possibly more. But yeah, Melbourne was for a long time the premier city in Australia, even more so than Sydney, which these days people would consider the premier city in Australia. So I accidentally hit the wrong button. I want to show off a railway station here, because I actually wanted to talk about the railways in the game. And yeah, but just talking about Melbourne for a second longer, it was in the 19th century certainly the premier city in Australia, back before Australia was a single nation, and it was only really in the early part of the 20th century that I guess in the popular conscience, Sydney sort of surpassed Melbourne as that premier city, although as any Melbourneite will tell you, Melbourne is clearly the better city. And there can be no arguments entered into about that. I wasn't entirely sure where I was going now. I want to show off the railway station, because the other thing that this game has is the railway network. In fact, your base of operations is a train that just constantly travels around this railway network. And it's a really cool feature, except that most of the time to get back onto the train after you complete a mission, or if you just want to go there for whatever reason, you have to fast travel there, because it's never where you need it to be. But that's cool. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to mention, this is just showing off the South London area, which was the industrialised area at the time, much more so than the north side of the city was. But one thing that I did a bit of research on this, because it was kind of annoying me as I was playing the game, and I kept thinking, hang on, this game's missing something really important from London at that time, which is that there's no London Underground railways, which would have existed at the time this game was set, as I just dash across these railway lines, which is actually quite a dangerous thing to do in this game, and several times I've attempted to do that and a train has snuck up behind me. You might wonder how a train sneaks up on you. Well, play this game and you'll find out. But yeah, so one thing this game doesn't seem to have, and there is a section of the game where it's clear they're digging some kind of railway tunnel, maybe it's a sewage tunnel, I'm not sure. But for the most part, the London Underground isn't in this game. By 1868, the earliest London Underground tunnels would have existed and would have been open for business. So either it's in the game and I just haven't played that far into the game to open it up that area, but I suspect it's more a case that it simply isn't in here and it's just these massive overground railway lines that they have in the game. And I actually don't know, and I tried researching this because one of the things that fascinates me about the early history of London is it's the development of its underground railway system, which is quite actually an interesting history, especially when you get into all the abandoned stations and stuff like that. But what I don't know a lot about is the railway infrastructure that existed before that this game is showing off here, the whole above ground railway. So I'm not sure how realistic it is the way it's presented in this game. It looks nice and it works well, but I don't know how realistic it is. But yeah, so Anyway, there's not a lot of video to go, so I'm going to wrap things up because it ends around this corner. And yeah, that was all I really wanted to say about Assassin's Creed, was this whole idea of the place it is and everything it offers, and how it all comes together. So thank you all for watching, and I will leave a nice bit of black screen here while I talk longer than the video ran, and I'll see you all next time.